Hi guys, today we'll be doing sources of law. So, first we'll be seeing from where law has come. So, to have a clear and complete understanding of law, we have to analyze, and it is essential to understand the sources of law. Sources of law means from where law has originated. So, if you need to know a clear and a proper understanding of law, you need to know where it has originated or where it has come from. So, sources of law means the sources from where law or the binding rules of human conduct. See, binding rules of human conduct is nothing but your law, right? Binding rule means the laws that the humans have to follow, originate. Okay, so sources of law mean the sources from where the law or the binding rules of human conduct originate. So, in other words, law is derived from sources. Now, jurists have different views on the origin and sources of law as they have regarded the definition of law. So, as the term law has several meanings, legal experts approach the sources of law from various angles. So, law as a word has a lot of different meanings, a lot of different philosophers and jurists, they have their own opinions, own definitions on law. So, the legal expertise that are there, the legal experts that are there, they approach the source of law from various angles. So, for instance, they have given us Austin. He considers sovereign as the source of law. Sovereign is when there is a supreme ruler who takes all the major decisions. It's mostly seen in monarchy. So, as per Austin, he considers sovereign as source of law. Then we have Henry Maine. He considers custom as an important source of law. Then we have natural law schools that we saw in the previous chapter. So they consider nature and the human reasons as a source of law. And then you have theologists. So they consider religious scriptures as source of law. So different people are having different point of views on what as per them is the source of law. So, although there are various claims and counterclaims regarding source of law, meaning that although there are a lot of different opinions and a lot of different views on how law has originated, it is true that almost all societies law has been derived from a similar source. Although the opinions are different, but if we try to centralize the opinions, we will see that we will be able to find out that there is this particular point where we see a similar source from where law is getting emerged. Okay, so in this chapter we'll be majorly seeing the three major sources of law that can be identified in a modern society. We are talking about modern societies here. So the three major sources of law are: first is custom, then we have our judicial precedent, and then last we have our legislation. Okay, so we're going to begin with custom as a source of law. Okay, so as our paragraph starts, this line is very very important. So custom to be valid has to be observed continuously for a very long time without any interruption. So what this means basically is, see, custom is it's a practice that has been ongoing from a very very long time. That's why people tend to believe in it, right? So custom, to be valid, to be considered as a source of law, it has to be continuously followed for a long time. There shouldn't be halts or breaks between it. Like, it shouldn't be that you're following it for 1 year, then you disregard it or something, and then again you are following it the third year. No, it has to be continuously followed, right? Okay, so so not only it has to be followed for a long time, but it has to be supported by opinion of general public and morality. So it's not just you are following it for a very long time so it can be considered as a source of law. No, it has to be supported by opinion of general public. It shouldn't be that the public is resenting means as in is opposing the custom. Still you are following it, still you're considering it as a source of law just because it has been followed continuously. No, you have to take in public opinion. You have to see if the public is satisfied by the custom. Only then it can be regarded as a source of law. And morality is very very common in every case in law. We'll see that morality has to be there in order for that thing to be regarded as legal or something that would be followed. So however, every custom need not be law. There are some customs that are not necessary to be a law. Further on we'll be seeing uh, what are the conditions that are needed for custom to be considered as a source of law. So for example, they have given you examples. So you have your Hindu Marriage Act 1955. So in this act, it basically specifies that it prohibits marriage within which are within the prohibited degrees of relationship. However, the act it still permits marriages within the prohibited degree of relationship if there is a proven custom within a certain community, right? Okay, so, custom can be simply explained as those long established practices. They're long established practices. Or you can also call it as unwritten rules. They're not something that have been written, right? They're just being followed from a very long time. So, people get habitual to follow it. It's not something that has been written anywhere. No, it has just been it's been followed from such a long time that people start believing it. Okay, so they have acquired binding or obligatory character. Obligatory means something that is mandatory to be followed, because people are used to following it. Something that is binding on human nature. Okay, so in ancient societies, custom was considered as the most important source of law. So even according to Henry Maine, he said that he used to consider custom as an important source of law. Okay, so with the passage of time, so as societies grew and a lot of changes happened in societies, there was the advent of modern civilization. Means modern civilization started appearing, started growing. So the importance of custom as a source of law, it started to diminish, it started to fade away. So other sources that we see, judicial proceedings and your legislation, they started gaining importance. Okay, so next we have, can custom be law? Okay, so there is no doubt that the fact that custom is important source of law. We all know that custom is a vital source of law, and there are two types of view that prevail in regard on whether custom is law. So first you have jurists such as Austin. Yeah, he opposed custom. Yeah, Austin always believed that it is the will of the sovereign, not the will of the people. He always supported sovereign. He always told that sovereign is the source of law. Never he supported custom. So he opposed custom as law because it did not originate from the will of sovereign, right? Because custom emerges as will of people, but he always went by will of sovereign. So he did not support it. While you see jurists like Savigny, he considered custom as a main source of law. So, according to him, the real source of law is the will of people. Will of people is custom, right? And not the will of sovereign. Okay. So, the conclusion that we see that custom is hence the main source of law. Okay, now they have given this small example here, Saptapadi. So Saptapadi is an example of custom as a source of law. So it is one of the most important ritual in the Hindu marriage ceremony. So basically, Saptapadi, it's nothing but 7 steps. Okay, so after you tie the Mangal Sutra in the neck of the newlywed wife, the newlywed couple, they take 7 steps around the holy fire, and that is basically what Saptapadi is. So it's basically a customary practice, and it had been incorporated in section 7 of the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955. All right, next we are going to see what are the types of customs. Okay, so mainly if you have to see the kinds of custom, we have two. One is without sanction and one is with sanction. Now in with sanction you have further classifications. So first let us see what is without sanction. Now the word sanction means custom without sanction. Sanction means something that is non-obligatory in nature, means it's not mandatory. See, custom without sanction means these kinds of customs that are non-obligatory in nature and are followed because of public opinion. They're not mandatory to be followed, they're just being followed because of public opinion. Okay, simple. Without sanction means they are not mandatory in nature, and they're just followed because there's public opinion. That's it. Next, we have customs with sanction. So these customs are binding in nature and they're enforced by states. So since these are being enforced by states, they're binding in nature in the sense that they are mandatory to be followed. They have to be followed because they have been enforced by the state. So there must be some cause that it's been enforced by the state. So they're binding in nature. So it can be further classified. So we have a legal custom and conventional customs. Okay. First, we have a legal custom. So, legal custom is a custom whose authority is absolute. You have to follow it. It possesses the force of law and it is recognized and it is enforced by the courts. Okay, in under legal custom, you have your general custom and your local custom. General custom, it prevails throughout the territory of the state. Okay, territory of the state, the entire territory of the state. Local custom is applicable to a part of the state, a particular region of that country. Okay. Next, you have conventional custom. So, conventional custom is nothing but they're binding on parties to an agreement. So, when two or more persons they enter into an agreement related to trade of goods and services, it is presumed in law that they may contract in accordance with established convention or usage of trade. Right. So, for instance, an agreement that has been taken place with between your landlord and your tenant regarding the payment of rent, it will be governed by the convention prevailing in this regard because it's an agreement, right? Two or more people are coming into an agreement. Okay, so this is conventional custom. Now, a very important paragraph that we see here, some important points. What are the essentials of a valid custom? So, how can you declare a custom as a source of law? How can you classify a custom as, see, basically all the customs that you have cannot be accepted as source of law, that we have already told. Or not, there are so many customs, right? Every region, every place in India follows so many different types of custom. So not all of them can be classified as source of law, right? And nor can all customs be recognized and enforced by the courts, right? Because there's so many customs. So the jurist and the court, they have laid down some essential tests for the customs to be recognized as valid source of law. So if your particular custom fulfills all these six essentials, then it can be classified as a source of law. So the first one we have is antiquity. So just remember, antiquity and continuous, these two essentials, they are quite similar. Antiquity says that in order to be legally valid, customs should have been in existence for a long time. So in order for a custom to be valid, to be legal, it has to be been existing from a long time. So when we started reading about customs, that was our first sentence that we read, that it has to be observed continuously for a long time without interruption. Same thing they're telling you, that it has to be in existence for a long time, even beyond the human memory. Okay, like they have given an example in England in the year 1189, the reign of Richard I, King of England, has been fixed for the determination of validity of custom. So this is beyond human memory, but it is considered as it has been fixed for the determination of validity of custom. However, if we look at the case of India, there is no time limit that has been decided for deciding that what is the fixed period. There is no fixed period in India, but the only condition is that those should have been practiced since time immortal. Means humans should not, even if they don't remember that when was this taking place, even then it should be followed. Means it should be followed for a very 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 long time in order to be considered valid. This is our first point. Second is continuous. Same thing, custom should be valid. Custom to be valid, it should be in practice from a very long time, okay, without interruption. And long intervals, disrupted practice of custom, they raise doubts about validity. If courts, see, basically, uh, for a custom to be considered as a source of law, uh, the custom is presented in front of the court. Now, the court will examine if it's fulfilling all these six essentials. If it is, it can be considered as a source of law, or else it won't be considered. So, if the court finds that there has been disrupted practice, means instead of it being followed for a long time, it was broken in between, people didn't follow it, then it can raise doubts about the validity. The court will also think that why was there disruption, they will think what was the reason behind it, and in that case there are a lot of chances that it won't be considered as a law. So this is also one essential. Third essential is exercise as a matter of right. So custom must be enjoyed openly, right? All the customs that are there, they have to be practiced openly, and it should be with the knowledge of community. It shouldn't be that two three people have decided a custom and they're just secretly doing it within their own space area. No, it should be openly enjoyed, and the knowledge should be there within the community. So it should not be in practice secretly, it should be done openly basically. So a custom must be proved to be a matter of right, and a mere doubtful exercise of a right is not sufficient to claim as a valid custom. Okay, so just by saying that it is an exercise of right, it is not sufficient to claim as a valid custom. It has to fulfill all the essentials. Not just see, just saying that it is exercised as a matter of right, just saying this, presenting in front of the court that my custom is exercised as a matter of right, cannot justify that it is a valid custom. No, it has to fulfill all the 6 points that are given, not just one, right? So it should fulfill all six. You cannot go and say it is fulfilling one, so it should be considered as a source of law. No, it has to fulfill all six essentials. Understood? Next, fourth one is reasonableness. So a custom must conform to the norms of justice. Norms means the rules regulations of justice. It shouldn't go against justice, right? And public utility, it shouldn't go against it. So a custom to be valid should be based on rationality, reason, morality, all this. Okay, so if a custom is likely to cause more inconvenience and mischief than convenience, such a custom is not valid. So if the judges feel, or if the society in fact feels that this custom is causing, instead of causing convenience, it is causing us more inconvenience, or it is causing us trouble, then it won't be considered valid. Because for a custom to be considered valid, everyone, public opinion matters, everyone should be happy with that custom, right? So okay, now our second last one, morality. Okay, so custom which is immoral or opposed to public policy is not valid custom. Means something that is immoral, it's going against morality, that cannot be considered as a valid custom. Or something that is opposed to public policy, public is not happy with that custom, even then it cannot be considered a valid custom. Okay, now we have courts have declared many customs as invalid as they have practiced for immoral purpose. So there are a lot of customs that have been there that were practicing under immoral purpose. So the courts have declared these customs as invalid, and they were opposed to public policy as well. So these had been declared invalid. So like they have given an example over here, Bombay High Court in the case of Madura Naikin versus ESU Naikin. So they held that the custom of adopting a girl for immoral purpose is illegal. So this is an example. Our last essential is that status of custom with regard to legislation. Status of custom with regard to legislation. Okay, so in any modern state, when a new legislation is enacted, it is generally preferred to the custom. So therefore, it is imperative that a custom must not be opposed or contrary to legislation. See, whenever in a country a new legislation is enacted, most of the time it is generally preferred to the custom, right? So now when that custom comes in place, the custom should not oppose or be contrary to legislation, because the legislation is working in favor of custom. So the custom cannot work, not in the favor of the legislation. It also has to go hand in hand. So it must not oppose or go contrary to the legislation. So many customs have been abrogated by laws enacted by the legislative bodies in India. For instance, you have the customary practice of child marriage that has been declared as an offense. Similarly, adoption laws have also been changed by legislation in India. Okay, so these are some six of the essentials of a valid custom. Okay, next we have what is the importance of custom as a source of law in India. In India, okay, so, as we all know, in ancient times, custom was one of the most important source of law. Even the British initially adopted the policy. Okay, so British courts in particular, the Privy Council. So at that time, it was known as the Privy Council. In the cases such as Mohammed Ibrahim versus Sheikh Ibrahim, observed and underlined the importance of custom in molding law. So they stated that custom was so important that it used to shape the law, right? It was like a framework for the law that was there. So at the same time, it is important to note that customs were not uniform or universal throughout the country, right? Because every state were having their own customs. So it is, you can never say that all the states were having uniform universal customs. No, every state was having different customs, right? So some regions of the country had their own custom and usage. Every region had their own practices. So these variances in customs they were considered as a hindrance in the integration of various communities of country, because there were so many customs prevailing that it proved to be a hindrance. It's a blockage, right? Because so much is there that you have to analyze, you have to see everything. So there was a hindrance. So after independence and with the enactment of the constitution, Indian parliament that took place, it took a lot of steps, and it abrogated many old customary practices. Means it stopped the old customary practices with some progressive legislation. Abrogated is, they changed the old customary practices, they changed it with the new legislation. Progressive means that was ongoing, that was going on. So Hindu personal laws were codified, and the Hindu Marriage Act 1955 and Hindu Adoption Act 1955 were adopted. So after the independence, all this was taken place. So after independence, the importance of custom has definitely diminished as a source of law, and judicial precedent and legislation has gained more significant place. Okay, so a large part of Indian law, especially your personal laws, they are still governed by custom, though they have diminished over time. But we can never say that it has stopped or it is not seen anymore. No, it has diminished, but it is still prevailing in some areas. Okay, so with this we are done with custom. Next, we have judicial proceeding as a source of law. Judicial proceeding is very easy. It is basically when it refers to the previously decided judgments of the superior courts, such as your High Court or your Supreme Court and your Supreme Court, which the judges are bound to follow. Suppose there was a judgment that was passed by the Supreme Court, and later on, after few years, there was a local level court, for example, who came across a similar case. Okay, similar case that the Supreme Court dealt with 5 years ago, let's say. So in this point of time, the local court that is there, they are allowed to take judicial proceedings from the decided judgments of the superior courts, right? They're allowed to do so. They're allowed to go back and see the judgments that were passed. Okay, so this is basically what is judicial proceeding. So this binding character of the previously decided case is important considering the hierarchy of courts, right? In India we have a hierarchy. How is it hierarchy? First we have our Supreme Court, High Court, local court, then you have district level courts, then you have session courts. So it's all in a level that is going one, two, three, from high to low, right? So it is so in India this hierarchy has been established by the Constitution of India. Okay. Judicial proceeding is also very very important source of law, and it is one of the most important features of the English legal system. Okay, so in most of the developed legal systems, judiciary is considered to be an important organ of the state, right? Judiciary is one of the most important organ of the state. Judiciary's role is basically to adjudicate the disputes, right? And interpret, also interpret the laws that have been passed by legislative. So it is considered to be a very important vital organ of the state. So in modern societies rights are generally conferred on the citizens by legislation. See, in modern societies, as we always mention, that legislature is creating laws. So general, if we talk in that point of view, we always see that most of the times it's the legislation creating the laws, and that is generally binding on the citizens. But with the ongoing time changing society, we get to see a lot of different changes. Now we have delegated legislations, right? Quasi judicial system means the power of the legislation is given to judiciary, to executive, not only done by the legislation, right? So and the main function of judiciary is to adjudicate upon these rights. So the judges decide those matters on the basis of legislation and prevailing custom, but while doing so they play a creative role by interpreting the law. Creative role in the sense of social activist, so they interpret the law. Okay, so uh, they adjudicate the law, of course they adjudicate upon these rights, but they also play the role of interpreting the law. Understood? So okay, so this is judicial proceeding. Next we have doctrine of precedent in India, a British legacy. Okay, so pre-independence, so before India was declared independent, we had, according to section 212 of the Government of India Act 1919, the law laid down by federal court and any judgment of the Privy Council was binding on all courts of British India. See, at that point of time, before India was considered independent, the Privy Council that was there was the supreme judicial authority. Remember that. After independence, your Supreme Court was the judicial authority, the supreme judicial authority. But before independence, when the British was ruling India, our Privy Council was the supreme judicial authority. Now, after post independence, the Supreme Court became the supreme judicial authority, and its streamlined system of courts was established. Means under the Supreme Court, few branches were established just as a helping. So Supreme Court is binding on all courts in India, right? It's the highest court and highest rank of court in India. So it is not bound by its own decisions or decisions by Privy Council or Federal Court. Of course, now since it's after independence, so it is not binding on decisions of Privy Council. Okay, then next we have high courts. Okay, so first you have Supreme Court, High Court, Lower Court. High courts are binding on all courts within its own jurisdiction. Every state of India has high courts, and I think there are 25 high courts in India. So it is binding on all the courts within its own jurisdiction, means within its territory of that state, it has to take care of all the courts. It is binding, it is responsible for the courts within its own jurisdiction. Only persuasive value of for courts outside its jurisdiction. In case of conflict with decision of same court and bench of equal strength, refer to a higher bench. So in case there is any conflict within the decision of the same court, high court and high court, so a bench of equal strength is referred to a higher bench. Okay, so decisions can be taken accordingly. Then we have lower courts. So lower courts are bound to follow decisions of higher courts. Yeah, it is automatically understood. Any decision that has to be taken has to be followed by the higher court in case of lower courts. So in preference to high court of other state. Okay. Next, we have judicial decisions can be divided into two parts. So first we have ratio descendi. Okay, so basically, ratio descendancy refers to the binding part of the judgment. Okay, it's the binding part of judgment. It is the reasons for the decisions. What was the reasons because of which decisions was taken? That is that is the meaning of ratio descendancy. So it is considered as the general principle which is deducted by courts from the facts of a particular case, right? Whatever case they get on whatever matter, whatever reasons they take out, that is the general principle that is taken in place. So it becomes generally binding on the lower courts in future cases that involve similar questions of law. As I already mentioned, suppose a lower court gets a similar type of case that has already been addressed in the Supreme Court or High Court, so it is binding on the lower court to involve similar questions of law. They have to take the help of judicial proceeding. Next, we have obiter dicta, means refers to the parts of judicial decisions where which are general observations of judge and they do not have binding authority. They are just general observations that the judge has made, but then they don't have binding authority. They're not necessary to be followed. You can, of course, you can what do you call? You can go through it. You can see through it if it is relating to your case. If it can help you can use it, but it's not binding on you to use it. It's not mandatory. However, obiter of higher judiciary is given due consideration by lower courts and has persuasive value. So if there is a obiter dicta by a higher judiciary, then it is given consideration, of course, and it has persuasive value, means it has the value to convince the lower court to take judgments in a better way, in a good way, and taking reference of that judicial proceeding. Okay, so having considered the various aspects of proceeding, the ratio and obiter, it is clear that the system of proceeding is based on hierarchy of courts, as I already mentioned. Right, we have a Supreme Court, High Court, Lower Court. So therefore it is important to understand the hierarchy of courts in order to understand the precedent, right? So every legal system has its own distinct feature, right? So therefore doctrine of preceding is applied differently in different countries. It is not necessary the way India follows, that's the same way US will follow or UK will follow. Not necessary. Every country has its own distinct feature, has its own different legal system, right? So in India, the doctrine of preceding is based on concept of hierarchy of courts. In other country, probably there is no hierarchy of courts. So it differs. The concept, the meaning remains the same, but the way to follow it, the way to enact it changes according to every country. So, in modern system of proceeding developed in India during British rule, it was the British who introduced system of courts in India, right? So, hierarchy of courts in British India. So, you had your Privy Council, then you had your Federal Court, and you had your High Court. So, in your High Court, you had your Presidency Court in town and your Mufassil Court in district. Okay, however, post independence, after the independence, India adopted its own constitution, which provided for a hierarchical judicial system. So, the Supreme Court of India, which was established by Constitution of India, came into existence on 28th of January 1950 under Article 124, Clause 1 of the Constitution of India. So Supreme Court had replaced the Federal Court. So previously, during the British era, pre-independence, the federal court was addressed as the Supreme Court. So now the Supreme Court replaced the federal court established by the Government of India Act 1935. Supreme Court of India is the apex court in the hierarchy of courts, means it's the highest level of court, right? It is followed by your high court and the state level. Below them you have your district court. Usually in district courts it's moreover handling of civil cases. Sessions court, you see your criminal cases, okay? So over here we have that. So hierarchy of criminal justice system, criminal is seen in the case of sessions court. So first you have your Supreme Court. This diagram is very important and you have to draw it exactly when it comes in your exam. So first we have our Supreme Court. Okay. Then we have our High Court. Then you have your Sessions Court, right? Because criminal justice system. Then you have your Assistant Sessions Judge. Then you have your Chief Judicial Magistrate. Then you have your Judicial Magistrate first class and Judicial Magistrate second class. Okay, Supreme Court, High Court, Sessions Court, Assistant Session Judge, Chief Judicial Magistrate, First Class, Judicial Magistrate, Second Class. This is for criminal judicial system. Next, we have hierarchy for civil judicial system. Okay, so you have your Supreme Court, you have your High Court. Here you have your session. Here you have your District Court. Here you had Sessions Court. Here you have your District Court. Then you have subordinate judge one, subordinate judge class two. Then under this we have Court of Small Causes for metropolitan cities and Munsif's Court or Court of Sub Judges three class. Okay, Supreme Court, High Court, District Court, Subordinate Judge Class 1, Subordinate Judge Class 2, Court of Small Cases for Metropolitan Cities, and Sub Judge 3rd Class. Okay. Next, we have, in a nutshell, the decisions that have been given by the Supreme Court are binding on all the courts. So, whatever decisions have been taken by the Supreme Court, that is binding on all the courts throughout the territory of India. Okay, whatever decisions, because Supreme Court is the highest court, right? So, whatever decisions it takes, it is binding on all courts. While the decisions given by high courts are binding on subordinate courts within jurisdiction of that particular high court. So, all the subordinate courts, suppose let's take example of Gujarat. In Gujarat, the High Court is there, right? Within that jurisdiction, you have your Gujarat High Court. Now, whatever subordinate courts are there within Gujarat, within the territory of Gujarat, only over there the decisions that have been taken by Gujarat's High Court are binding. Not on the subordinate courts of, suppose, let's say, Mumbai or some other state. No, only those subordinate courts within the territory of Gujarat are binded by decisions of High Court. Okay, the decisions of High Court are not binding beyond their respective jurisdiction. No, Rajasthan, Punjab, these all won't get affected by decisions of High Court. No, only within the jurisdiction, whatever subordinate courts come, they will be affected by the decisions. Okay, next we have, do judges make law? So, the Constitution of India confers power on the legislature to make the law, right? We have three branches of law: legislature, executive, judiciary, or judiciary, executive. So, legislature's role is to make the law. Judiciary has the power to examine the constitutionality of the law enacted. Yeah, okay, so basically judiciary has to adjudicate the disputes, interpret the laws, and examine the constitutionality of the laws that have been enacted by legislature. Is it correct or not? What amendments can be done? So the courts also adjudicate upon the rights and duties of citizens, and further they interpret the provisions of constitution and other statutes. So if they feel that there are some things that have to be changed, they interpret the provisions of the constitution. Next, we have through these processes, the courts create new rights for the citizens, right? And it makes additions to the existing law for the country. So it's basically for the betterment of the country. Okay. Next, we have there are two views regarding this issue. So, one set of jurists say that judges can do not make law, right? But they simply declare existing law, and another set of jurists say that judges they make law. So jurists like Edward Koch and Matthew Hale are of the opinion that judges do not make law. According to them, they are saying that judicial decisions are not sources of law. Means whatever the judicial decisions are arising after the interpretation of the case, they are not from where the law has originated. They are simply the proof of what the law is, right? So judges are not lawgivers, they discover law. Okay, but at the same time, they are jurists like you have your Gray, Salmon. So they are in the opinion that judges they make laws. So they hold the view that judges, while interpreting laws enacted by legislature, they contribute to the existing body of law. So these people feel that. Of course, we know judiciary interprets the law that has been enacted by legislature. They go through those laws, so they believe that while the judiciary is going through the laws, they contribute to the existing laws. And a large part of English law is judge made laws, right? Even in English law, we see that a large part is judge made laws. Okay. Next, we have the above arguments seem to be complementary. It can be inferred that judges do not make laws in the same matter in which legislative body do. Of course, the state has appointed a specific legislative body to make the law, so of course we cannot compare judges with that. So the legislative body, of course, it cannot be inferred that judges make law in the same manner. Of course, that's not possible. So judges work on the given legal material that has been passed. That is material passed as law by legislation. So, while declaring the law, judges interpret the legislation in question and play a creative role. Okay, by this creative role, judges contribute significantly in development of the law. Okay, then we have okay. So then we see that these laws can be interpreted by Article 21. Article 21 is nothing but right to life. Next, we have legislation as a source of law. Last topic. Legislation is also considered one of the most important source of law. It comes from the Latin word which means law, and legis, which means law, and Latin which means to make. So legislation means the making of law. So the fact that it is backed by authority of sovereign and it is directly enacted and recognized by state. Okay, so in legislation, you have two types. You have your supreme legislation, your subordinate legislation. Under subordinate legislation, you have five types: autonomous, judicial, local, colonial, and executive legislation. So first we'll be seeing supreme legislation. So laws that are directly enacted by sovereign are considered supreme legislation, and no other authority except sovereign can check or control these laws. So the laws that were enacted by British Parliament, they used to fall under this category because the British Parliament was considered sovereign. Then we have subordinate legislation, so which is made by any authority which is subordinate to the supreme or sovereign authority. Okay, so under this we have autonomous law, when a group of individuals recognize the law that is conferred with the power to make rules and regulation. Law made by such a body falls under autonomous law. Okay, judicial rules. Judiciary is conferred with the power to make rules for the administrative procedures. Like under the Constitution of India, Supreme Court, High Court have been conferred with such kinds of power to regulate procedure and administration, right? Because Supreme Court is highest, second highest we have High Court, so they have these powers to regulate the procedure and administration. Local laws, like they're recognized and conferred by the law making powers. Not all countries have local laws, but in India we do have local bodies like panchayats, municipal corporations, that have been recognized by the constitution through the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment. Okay, then we have colonial rules. Law made by colonial countries for their colonies are known as colonial rules laws. And India was governed by laws passed by British Parliament, right? Before, it was governed by the British Parliament's laws. However, most countries of the world have gained independence from colonial powers. Legislation is losing its importance and may not be recognized as kind of legislation. Okay, last we have laws made by executive. So laws are supposed to be enacted by sovereign, and sovereign may be vested in one authority or it may be distributed among various organs of state, right? In most modern states, sovereignty is generally divided among the three organs of state, right? Legislative, executive, and judiciary. So prime responsibility of lawmaking, it rests in the hands of legislature, while executive is vested with the responsibility to implement, to execute those laws. However, legislature delegates some lawmaking power to executive organ, which is termed as delegated ledger. The legislation is giving some of its powers to the executive organ. So delegated legislation is also a class of subordinate legislation. So with this, we are done with our chapter. um, yes, thank you.